I once read that giving an interesting fact at the start of your video increases audio retention, so there's that. Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to yet another 3D pilot video. Last time I talked a little bit about how materials are an essential part of your render, but I didn't really answer how you should make these materials. So this first video will be a little bit about how you should think about materials, how they are made up in a 3D environment. Because of course in real life materials are just what they are and they have physical properties themselves. But in 3D we have to give these properties to a certain object ourselves. Throughout this series I'll be using PBR techniques. This stands for physically based rendering. And it's just a system of making materials that guarantees having materials that are really accurate to the physical world properties of objects. So no matter if you're making plastics or metals or woods, these materials will look realistic. That's the whole point of PBR. Now the way you should think about materials is not just as a whole or as being a color, but you should think about them as composed of different elements. Because basically, just like in the real world, light reflects off objects, light is absorbed by objects in a physical way. So basically you should think about materials as having different parts. Light that comes into an object, into a surface, is reflected, is refracted if your product is transparent. Light can be absorbed or scattered through an object or even emitted by your product. And it's a good practice to know what these different types of light, components of light do. So we can use them in our advantage and make really nice materials. So the first and most basic component of a material is the diffuse light. Now that is light that hits an object and then is reflected in every direction about equally. Here's an example of an object that reflects light very diffusely. You can see that the object is very matte. You can see almost no reflections, but you can see some shadows and some highlights, but they're really, really matte. Things like paper or cloth are pretty much only diffuse light, with a little bit of glossy mixed in them. There's never one material that is only made up of one kind of light. But yeah, that's just an example of a diffuse material. Now next is a glossy material. You should definitely think about metals, but plastics as well. And that is light that is reflected as well, but not equally in all directions. But it's reflected at the same angle that the light hits your surface. Now the most basic type of glossy shader is just a chrome shader, like a mirror. And that reflects light perfectly in exactly the same direction as light hits the surface. But depending on the roughness, the microsurface properties of your surface, light gets diffused a little bit. If you take a glossy shader and make it rougher, you can see that the reflection starts to look more like a diffuse shader. Next one is transparency. So here we're thinking about light that gets reflected inside of your material. So here you should be thinking about glass, of course, fluids, most fluids as well, and all kinds of transparent plastics. Now you can give a color to the transparency so your object looks colored. That's a shader type that we use for all kinds of transparent materials. Now emissive materials are another category of objects that actually emit light. So here you should think about, for example, the little filament in a light bulb actually emits light, but we use things like lights that are used in a studio can be replicated in 3D by just making a big plane and letting that have an emission material. Now the next component is subsurface scattering. So subsurface scattered light is light that enters your model for a couple of millimeters and then bounces around inside of your material and bounces back out somewhere else. This happens especially for organic materials. Things like a skin definitely has subsurface scattering, but also waxy materials or soaps or fruits or anything that is not really transparent but still lets some light through, like the milk from the last example. That was the big difference between the two glasses. One had subsurface scattering and one didn't. You can have a look at that. This is a component that is very often overlooked because you can't really see it that obviously, but when it is missing you often feel that there is some fakeness to your model, especially if you expect there to be some subsurface scattering. Now there's some other really special kinds of shaders, like a velvet shader, which makes objects look like they are covered in really fine hairs. There's a translucent shader, which is especially made for really thin objects like paper or plastic foils that lets light pass through it, kind of like subsurface scattering. But in Blender that's just a way to make rendering a lot faster for translucent materials. Another one is anisotropic shading, which you can see with metal objects mostly that are brushed in one direction or circular, like this pen. And another nice one, which isn't PBR related, it's supposed to look fake, is a Toon shader, and that is often used with rendering, for example, anime characters. A lot of the anime that is made in Japan isn't actually drawn by hand, but are 3D models that are rendered with this kind of materials. Now that kind of Toon rendering, called NPR rendering, non-photorealistic rendering, is really interesting, but I'm not going to cover it in this video. We're going to focus on PBR, physically based rendering. Now there's a bunch more of really complicated materials. There are some examples here. but most of the time you can make these materials by correctly combining the different shaders I just showed you. Now, as I said, most objects are a combination of a couple of these shader types. For example, a wood has some diffuse to it, which gives it a nice color. It's also got some glossiness, some reflection, especially if it's coated with lacquer, for example. And if you've got a really light wood, light enters it as well, and you have the subsurface scattering going on. So you have to mix these different shader types together. Now, that used to be kind of a pain in the ass in Blender before, but luckily there's now a principled shader node which combines all of these different shader types together and lets you adjust them with just a couple of sliders. Now, the principled shader makes sure to combine these in a really realistic way. I'm not going to go into that, but you've got the Fresnel effect, you've got the correct roughness with Fresnel, you have to think about the conservation of light energy, but the principled node takes care of that all, so you don't have to worry about that. So how do you go about making a basic material like that, a plastic or a metal? Well, it's really simple. Just add a principled shader, and then you can adjust the different parameters to have a really simple and clean material. Really important first step is to choose if you're going to make a metal or a plastic or anything that's not a metal, basically. We call that a dielectric, because metals and dielectrics have a very different way of reflecting light in the physical world. So you definitely have to think about that. Next up, you pick the color that you want for your model. You pick the roughness until you've got the nice, the correct glossiness that you wanted. And if you need some transparency, you can turn that on. Or have some subsurface scattering even. Subsurface scattering is a little bit harder to deal with, but it's very, very important. It is often overlooked because you can't see it that clearly, but it's really an important part of your render, and definitely thin materials or materials that should have light passing through them, and if they don't have subsurface scattering, it doesn't look really good. So definitely think about that if you can. So as I said, that gives you perfectly clean plastics or metals, but of course, that's not a lot of detail. Sometimes you want to make woods, you want to make stones, you want to make things that have surface bumps, things that look painted and have little drips running down them. There's a bunch of different materials, and for that you need textures. Now, that's for my next video. I'm going to talk about how you apply a 2D texture to a 3D model, and a little bit about procedural textures as well, which are really interesting for generating detail on the fly. But yeah, if you want to learn more about PBR shading, definitely check out the links in the description. I added a video by Blender Guru, which is my favorite tutor. He's got a lot of great videos talking about materials, about lighting, about modeling, a bunch of different techniques, and he's the one that actually taught me to use Blender. So it's definitely worth it to go head out to his channel. In the video I linked, he explains the concept of PBR a lot more clearly than I did, but I wanted to take the opportunity to give a little introduction to what materials are made of in 3D and how you can actually generate those. I also want to remind you that the competition for winning a full color 3D print of your surface model that you made in SolidWorks is still on. You can still enter your model, no matter if it's made in Blender or SolidWorks. You just have to have a couple of different textures applied, so you can definitely head to the 3D Pilot Facebook page and add your model over there. Have a look at it, and I've got 18 models by now. I've got some Ice Age models, I've got a model from Harry Potter, I've got some ocean creatures. It's just great that you're all entering really beautiful renders. If I'm looking at the renders this year, I think they improved a lot over the years that have come before. So I think you're doing a great job. I don't know how much of that improvement I contributed to, but I think it's just great that you're all heading into rendering and making realistic and interesting and really cool and sexy renders. So definitely keep practicing. One last tip I wanted to give you is that whenever you make a render, ask someone else to have a look at it. And maybe they'll spot something, maybe it's a little bit dark, a little bit light, the composition is a little bit off, you've got shadows in weird places. We don't always see that when you're making a render yourself. So it's always a good idea to ask someone else, ask a colleague, to have a little look at your render and see if they spot anything that can be improved. But that'll be it for this video. I'll see you next week. I really want to thank you for watching. You can subscribe down below if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!